All right, good morning. Thank you for joining us for the webinar, Teaching Sex Ed Digital Literacy Skills. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted. If you have any questions that you would like addressed after the presentation, please use the Q&A box that's located in the center bottom Zoom bar on your screen. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical questions. My name is Savannah Holt. I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that's located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our organizational focus is to reduce disabling conditions in children using primary prevention methods. We raise awareness by providing training, information, and resources based on current best evidence. We believe that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including sexual and reproductive health, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, maternal and infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, child traffic safety, and parenting. One focus of this sexual and reproductive health program is to provide evidence-based information on sexual and reproductive health that is accessible to health educators and to the youth that they work with. Youth today are online and utilizing digital technology more than ever before, and virtual connection during the COVID-19 pandemic has created even more need for online engagement for young people. Teaching young people the skills they need to engage safely online and critically interpret the information that they encounter is important and can help contribute to safer, healthier relationships and decision-making. Here to talk about digital literacy skills today is our speaker, Matthew Johnson from mediasmarts.ca. Matthew Johnson is the Director of Education for MediaSmarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. He is the author of many of MediaSmart's lessons, parent materials, and interactive resources, and a lead on MediaSmart's Young Canadians in a Wired World research project. As an acknowledged expert in digital literacy and its implementation in Canadian curricula, Matthew is the architect of MediaSmart's Use, Understand, Create digital literacy framework for Canadian K-12 schools. He has contributed blogs and articles to websites and magazines around the world, as well as presented MediaSmart's materials on topics such as copyright, cyberbullying, body image, and online hate to parliamentary committees, academic conferences, governments, and organizations around the world, frequently as a keynote speaker. He has served as an expert panels convened by the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Ontario Network of Child and Adolescent Inpatient Psychiatric Services, and others. He's consulted on provincial curriculum for the Ontario Ministry of Education, and he has been interviewed by outlets such as the Globe and Mail, BBC News Magazine, Science Monitor, Radio Canada International, and CBC's The National. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. And it's a real pleasure to be able to share our material today and to be able to share our approach to digital and media literacy, and of course, how that specifically relates to sexual health education. So you've already had a little bit of an introduction to who I am and a little bit to who MediaSmarts is. We've been around, actually, this is our 25th anniversary this year, depending on how you count. And our vision remains the same as it was 25 years ago, which is to ensure that children and youth have the critical thinking skills that they need to engage with all of the media that they use and consume as active and informed digital citizens. And of course, that word digital was not really in our vision at the beginning, 25 years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about that, how that has changed our approach while our mission has remained the same. Now, you also heard that one of the parts of my job as Director of Education is to participate in committees, to participate in reviewing standards on panels. I work with the Canadian Pediatric Society's Digital Health Task Force is probably the best known that we've done. But one thing that I am particularly proud of in the last couple of years is that I was one of the panelists who developed the current version of the Canadian guidelines for sexual health education. So I will be talking a little bit about that as well, and making some reference to that. In fact, let's start with that, because I think it is the clearest explanation, the clearest way of saying how media and digital literacy connect to sexual health. And that is simply, and this is from those guidelines, that sexual health education programs should facilitate the development of media and digital literacy skills. And that's a big part of our mission, is to show that media and digital literacy are an essential part of really every curriculum. Every aspect of the curriculum, every subject has media and digital literacy connections. Specifically to sexual health, it's about critically evaluating material they encounter that represents sexuality, whether it is explicit sexual content, which we know, of course, young people often encounter intentionally or unintentionally, but also sexualized content, which we know appears really very early on, and is persistent through youth media and, of course, grown-up media in so many different ways. And, of course, to develop the knowledge and skills to use communication technologies safely and respectfully. So we'll be coming back to both of those, but that really does summarize what I'm going to be talking about today. Critically evaluating representations of gender and sexuality, and related things like relationships. So, as I was saying, when we see representations of things we're familiar with, things like our own neighborhoods, then we can see immediately that they're not accurate. But when we see representations of things that we don't have firsthand knowledge of, then it becomes much more difficult. So when we look, for instance, at things like representation of crime or police work or even medicine, in those cases, media has a much bigger influence than other sources, firsthand knowledge, family, and so on, because we don't have the corrective knowledge of those. We don't have that firsthand knowledge. And with young people, of course, that means that media representations of sexuality, media representations of relationships, these are hugely influential. And even though we don't have the kind of monoculture media that we once had, even though we don't have those 3 channels anymore where everyone was watching the same thing, we still see the same kinds of consistent trends and tropes, the same kinds of cliched representations that have an influence on how young people and adults perceive sexuality. Talking about media literacy, though, it's important to make a distinction between what it is and what it isn't, because media literacy, although it's been in the curriculum of each province and territory in Canada for almost 20 years now, it's still, to a large extent, widely misunderstood. So very briefly, it's important to know media literacy is not just teaching with videos. That can be a springboard for media literacy, but it's not media literacy by itself. It's also not just about making media. Now, that's a bigger part of media literacy. In some ways, it is harder to be fully media literate if you have no experience making media, because it really does give you an understanding of a medium in a way that you can't get just by learning about it academically. Media literacy is not just looking from one perspective. That's probably the hardest thing for a teacher to do. Because of course, if you are a media literacy educator, you have your own opinions, you've drawn your own conclusions, but we can't just deliver kids those opinions, those views. We have to give them the tools to analyze on their own. And as we'll see, they may come to entirely legitimate conclusions that are different from ours because they're coming from a different place, and we have to respect that. Similarly, media literacy can't be about bashing media, and it can't be about telling students don't watch, even if we're talking about something that we are, personally opposed to, or that we feel is really inappropriate for them, like pornography. Taking a negative approach really just turns kids off, and more importantly, it's a betrayal of the spirit of media literacy, which is critical engagement. We know, for instance, that when we talk about pornography, we know that kids are going to see it. We need to accept that, and we need to prepare them to be aware of how it fails to reflect reality and the ways that it can give them a false impression about relationships and sexuality. And that is why our model of media literacy is one that is all about empowerment. It's not about protecting kids. It is, as we'll see, about giving kids the opportunity and the tools to protect themselves if they want to. But it's not about shielding them. It's about empowering them. And empowerment education is education that values young people's involvement. We're not telling them things, we're asking them their thoughts, we're giving them the tools to critically engage with media. Media literacy provides authentic experiences because we should be talking about the media platforms that they use and the media texts that they consume. And empowerment education is grounded in where youth are at developmentally. So it really is about giving kids the opportunity to grow their cognitive development, to grow their moral development, to grow their critical thinking. When we try to define what media literacy is, there are a couple of different ways we can approach it, and they are complementary. One of them is looking at it as a process, that it is the process of becoming active users and consumers of all media. So we're not just passively consuming, we're not just using a tool in the default way that was given to us. We're making conscious choices, we're making conscious reactions, we're asking questions. And that's why we can also look at it from a skills perspective, where media literacy is the ability to access, to analyze, to evaluate, and to produce media. Access means finding and accessing the media that you want. Now, that used to be pretty simple, again, in that 3-channel universe, but now finding exactly what you want and sorting it out, sifting it out from the information that maybe you don't want or don't need has become one of the primary challenges of media and digital literacy education. To analyze media literally means to take it apart, to deconstruct it, to understand how it was made. And that, again, is why media production is a really valuable tool. To evaluate media means to place it into a larger context, to think about what it means. You can't evaluate media unless you're able to analyze it. But the end purpose of analysis is evaluation. And finally, of course, producing media, the ability to make media. In the same way that writing is a part of literacy, making media is an essential part of media literacy. In Canada, where media literacy really was first developed as a subject at the K-12 level, we take what's called a key concepts approach. And that is to say that all of our media literacy education program is organized around a set of key concepts. And the practice of media literacy education really is about making these concepts clear to kids in ways that make sense to them and are appropriate for their context, depending on what media they're using and consuming, and their developmental level. That obviously we understand concepts at different levels of complexity at different ages. So key concepts, first of all, empower teachers to develop and adapt activities. As you'll see, we have a very large collection of resources that teachers can draw on. But what we really want is that teachers can understand these key concepts so that they can adapt these resources to their own contexts or develop new resources on their own. key concepts keep resources from becoming obsolete because they're based on a theoretical model. They're not necessarily based on a particular medium or a particular thing that's happening right now. And so when we update resources, I'm not going to say they never take updating because that's a pretty big part of my job, but a lot of times the updating really is just changing the examples because the key concepts remain fundamentally solid. And most importantly, key concepts provide a learning path as children mature and develop. And so a lot of what we do is thinking about how do we communicate these key concepts to kids at different ages. These 5 key concepts are the original key concepts of media literacy. They're based on ones that were developed in the 1980s by the Association for Media Literacy, which is an organization that's still in operation. And has some terrific resources. I recommend them wholeheartedly. Now, they developed 8, which we've boiled down to 5, which we find more useful for a K-12 context. And the first of these, which I've already talked about a little bit, is the idea that media are constructions. That is to say that all of the media we use and consume were made by people. Now, that may seem obvious, but the fact is that our brains haven't really evolved to distinguish between things that we see on a screen or in another form like that, or things that we see in reality. We consciously, of course, know the difference between them. But emotionally, we treat them as the same. And again, when there isn't countervailing influence, when we're being shown things that we don't know anything about, or when we see something a lot more in media than in real life, we unconsciously take our lessons from media. And the second thing about those constructions, why we use that term constructions, is because it's important to think about the fact that these were made as a series of choices by the people who made them. They were a series of decisions that influence everything about them. And that in many cases, these were unquestioned assumptions, that the questions that media makers didn't ask, the cliches they didn't bother to interrogate, the stereotypes that they didn't think twice about, the tropes of a genre that they adopted just because that's what they grew up watching. These are as influential or more influential than the conscious choices that they make. And that's what brings us to our second key concept. These other 4 key concepts all kind of flow out of that first one. The second one is that media have social and political implications. Our values, our political ideas, our ideas about things like gender and sexuality are all heavily influenced by media. One of the things that we do as teachers, and I say this as someone who was primarily an English teacher for close to 10 years at the secondary level, one of the things that we do that kind of sends a false message is that we often focus on works where the author had a conscious message, things like 1984 or Lord of the Flies. And the problem with that is that teaches kids unintentionally that if the author didn't have a conscious message, something doesn't have a political or a social meaning. But in fact, those things where there wasn't a conscious message actually have a stronger meaning, because when there is a clear political message, our intellect is engaged. We become aware, oh yes, this author is trying to tell us something, and so we engage with it intellectually. But when it's a comic book, when it's a video game, when it's a movie, when it's something where we don't feel like there is a conscious message, we don't have that same instinct. We don't have that same reaction to engage with it. The other thing that's important to be aware is that media influence is not about individual media texts, except in very rare cases. It's about all of the media texts. So if we see, for instance, one romantic comedy where stalking behavior is shown as romantic, well, one example maybe isn't that important. But if there are a lot of romantic comedies where stalking behavior is shown as romantic and shown as funny, then that becomes significant. And so we have to look at a whole genre or a whole group of texts. Another key concept is that media have commercial implications. Most media are created to make money, And so those choices are influenced by that decision. And almost all media cost money to make as well. And so to really understand, to really be able to evaluate and analyze media, we have to understand the commercial ecosystem that these things exist in. Audiences negotiate meaning. That means that the meaning of a media text is not fixed. It's a collaborative effort between the people who made the media and the individual people and groups of people who are consuming it. And that means that different people can take very different messages or different meanings from the same text. So you might find, for instance, that you might have a genre of movies or TV shows where the boys in your class and the girls in your class read it very differently. Or there might be some influence of culture where you have people from a particular community who read it very differently. And that's absolutely valid. That's an essential part of media literacy, is recognizing that that meaning is influenced. It's a negotiation. That doesn't mean, that, of course, that every reading is accurate, but it does mean that media don't simply have an influence on us. We interact with them, we choose them for specific purposes. And that, again, is why we can't just be about media bashing. We can't just be negative, because kids are choosing media, just like we are, for their own reasons. And finally, each medium has a unique aesthetic form, and that is that old McLuhan line, the medium is the message. The form itself has an influence on the content, on how the story is told. And so if you look at something, for instance, if you look at my classic example is The Hobbit, which it's been a book, it's been a video game, it's been a comic book, it's been a movie, it's been an animated cartoon, and in every case, the medium where that story was told had a big influence on how that story was told. So here's another line from the Canadian Guidelines for Sexual Health Education that looks specifically about media literacy, talking about how many people will be exposed to media portrayals of gender and sexuality that challenge sexual health and well-being in either positive or negative ways. So a big part of relating media literacy to sexual health education is specifically identifying and interrogating the ways that gender and sexuality are represented in media. And that's where key concepts come in. Key concepts, the fundamental value of them to us as teachers and as citizens, is to provide a lens to analyze any media text or experience. So I tend to think of the key concepts as sort of being like the different lenses that you can apply in a microscope, how each lens changes the focus, it changes how you look at something. So we may, for instance, consider when we're looking at relationships and sexuality in the media, we may consider three key concepts. We may focus first on the idea that media are constructions, that they are representations of something that influence how we view it. We may be thinking about the social and political implications, and we may think about the commercial considerations. How does the need to make money influence the decisions that were made? So for now, for instance, maybe we're not thinking about the individual media, we're looking generally at relationships and sexuality in the media. And here's an example of one of our lesson plans with that title it's aimed at grades 9 to 12. And one of the things that it does is it actually quizzes young people, quizzes students on their beliefs based on media about representations of sexuality. So we ask, how many teenagers do you think have had at least one boyfriend or girlfriend? Compared to 20 years ago, how early do you think teens today first have sex? In what medium do you think kids are most likely to be exposed to sexual content? And is it true that sex sells in media? And then, of course, because this is a really valuable social norming opportunity, we give them the answers that, in fact, only a third of teenagers have had at least one boyfriend or girlfriend, that teenagers today are actually older on average the first time they have sex than 20 years ago, that kids actually are most likely to be exposed to sexual content in TV than in any other medium, and that in fact, movies with sexual content make less money, and ads with sexual content are less likely to be remembered. So contrary to popular belief and contrary to conventional wisdom in the media industry, sex doesn't sell. And this shows how media makers, and this is an important lesson, media makers are not necessarily media literate, that they often buy into old conventional wisdom about their medium that is not necessarily supported by evidence. And there are good commercial, well, they're not good, but there are commercial reasons for this within the media industry. So we go on from this to asking some questions. We show them ads. Ads are a great way of looking at sexuality because they get very quickly. They need to make a quick impression. And so we see stereotyping often much more overtly in ads. So we say, take a look at these ads and we say, what do media say about men? So these are alcohol ads, because again, they tend to be the most direct. What do media say about men? So your dad was not a metrosexual. So there's definitely a model of masculinity that's being projected here. Men have to be manly. Here, the second one on the right, this is actually an ad. It's a PSA that's against binge drinking. And so it's implying that one of the most horrible things that could happen to you if you drink too much is that you might admit to your friends that you used to dance ballet. So we're seeing a really, really narrow definition of masculinity here. What do media say about women? Some more alcohol ads. So we see the images that with pornographic connotations, bondage imagery here, images where women are dismembered and deeply, heavily sexualized, the branding in the middle, the literal branding or tattooing, or on the right, definitely the idea of femininity as being associated with thinness is a really important one. But also here, the margarita you can trust, we are, making a kind of an oblique reference to date rape. So very complicated representations of women and relationships. So we take a look on the left side here, again, the way men and women are portrayed completely differently. Man in the business suit, man is being active, man is able to go out in the outside world, and then the woman on the right in an unstable position, literally barely dressed, could not possibly be going about doing anything in the outside world. The ideal relationship in the middle, man surrounded by adoring women, and on the right, talking about stalking behavior, here we see an ad that's normalizing stalking behavior where the male hand is erasing this person's partner so that he can possess her. So all of that has been talking about mass media. And mass media is still hugely influential. And we shouldn't assume that it isn't just because so much of kids' time is spent online, because they still consume those kinds of media just through digital forms. They still encounter those kinds of ads. They still encounter those tropes. They still watch romantic comedies. They still get exposed to those gender stereotypes. But it is also important to recognize that technology has changed the ways that we use and interact with media. And again, this is from the Guidelines for Sexual Health Education, modern communication technologies have changed the way people are exposed to, learn about, and communicate with respect to sexuality. And here's what's really important, that we need to recognize both the challenges and the benefits. And again, if as digital literacy educators, we fall down sometimes, it is an overemphasis on the challenges. And those challenges are absolutely important, but we need to also prepare them to take advantage of the opportunities, the benefits. And there's a lot of really good research that shows that that's not an either or, that in fact, the only really effective way of preparing them for the challenges is to help them access the benefits. So how has technology changed in the last 20 years? Well, this is, if you're my age, this is the technology, this is the media ecosystem that you grew up in, where media were produced by a small number of producers. They cost a lot of money to make, and then they cost even more money to distribute. And so it was very centralized. And also there was no way that we could answer back. I mean, you could write a letter, you could make a complaint, but there were very little opportunity to respond. It was essentially a one-way message. And similarly, consumers were isolated from one another. Maybe you might talk about what you watched the night before with people at school or at work, but fundamentally, individual consumers were isolated in that system. And this is the media ecosystem that we have today, where instead of being at the end of a chain, we're in the middle of an infinite network. And because it's infinite, we're all in the middle. But the important thing is that we can get from anywhere to anywhere else. Distribution has become free and frictionless. And we've seen that with things like YouTube and TikTok, how it's completely reshaped the media ecosystem in terms of how people make money, in terms of who has access, in terms of how our ability to find information. And so while those original 5 key concepts remain as important as ever, in the last few years, we've also had to develop 5 new key concepts that relate specifically to digital technology. So the first 5 key concepts that I have already told you about, they apply to all media. Doesn't matter what. Everything from a t-shirt to TikTok, from cave paintings to Snapchat. But these key concepts of digital literacy apply specifically to networked media. They are only about media where you are involved in a networked communication. Now, sometimes we may be in a networked environment without realizing it. So when we're watching Netflix, for instance, it may feel like we're watching TV in the traditional way, but it's not. When we're watching Netflix, we're always sending data back. Netflix is watching us. It's much more interactive. It's not as interactive, say, as something like YouTube, where you can leave comments. And certainly not as interactive as something like Twitter or Facebook, but it is fundamentally a networked. It's kind of what you might call it as a network bubble, because it doesn't connect to other parts of the network, but it is still a networked environment. Anyway, so that's our key concept. The first key concept, just like the first key concept of media literacy is that media are constructions, the first key concept here is that digital media are networked, that every connection is two-way, and you can get from anywhere to anywhere else. The implications of that, first, that digital media are shareable and persistent because it's so easy to share content. That is the default. Sharing is the default. And it's persistent because when we share things online, what we're doing is we're actually making copies. If I send you an email, I'm actually sending instructions for your email server to make a copy of my email. I'm not actually sending anything. Even when we stream something, like when we're watching Netflix or YouTube, first of all, it can be copied, but there is also a copy that's being created on your local device. It's just it's being deleted as it's being created, but they're still being copied. Similarly, we find that digital media have unexpected audiences. Because of that network, you never know for sure who is going to see content that you post online. Similarly, you never know for sure what you might see. You might be that unexpected audience. And as we'll see, that has major implications for youth using digital technology. The last 2 key concepts. First, that interactions through digital media can have a real impact. Compared to traditional media, we have a lot more power because it is interactive. We have the ability to have an impact on other people through things like cyberbullying. We also have an ability to have an impact on our communities. We shape the values of the communities that we participate in online, whether we mean to or not. And sometimes we do it by default, by not doing anything, but we have that ability. And similarly, we can use digital tools to make an impact on the offline world. And finally, digital media experiences are shaped by the tools we use. Just like the medium in which a story is told influences the content, the way a technology or tool is built influences how we use it. So we use, and we know this from our own research, that young people use Snapchat very differently from the way they use Instagram. Even though Snapchat and Instagram have fundamentally the same features, the fact that one feature is default, the disappearing photos, is a default in Snapchat and you have to select it in Instagram, had a huge influence that young people saw Instagram as essentially the social network of record, and said no one would ever be offended if someone shared a photo that you posted on your Instagram. You had to consider your Instagram public. But Snapchat was just the opposite. They said there was a tremendous taboo against making copies of Snapchat photos or sharing them without someone's consent. So when we talk about technology, again, it's important to be aware it's not just about technology, but it's not about technology, because so many of the things that we cover when it comes to digital literacy touch on other SEL skills. That when we talk about cyberbullying, for instance, a lot of the skills that we teach are the same as we would teach when it comes to traditional bullying, to offline bullying. A lot of the ways that people are able to intervene effectively when they witness it are the same. But the technology does come into play. There are reasons why people may be more likely to engage in cyberbullying than offline bullying because of the technology. There are reasons why people may be less willing to intervene because of the technology. And there are reasons why conflict may turn into drama, or vice versa. Drama may turn into outright conflict and bullying without anyone intending, because of the features of digital communication. So when we address digital technology, we can take the same approach by using these key concepts as lenses to analyze different phenomena. So we could start with digital media are networked, and this applies to two of the key media literacy benchmarks that are specifically related to STI prevention in the sexual health guidelines. And this is looking at how it applies at two different levels. At grades 4 to 5, it's very much about understanding the difference between good sources of information and inaccurate sources. So without necessarily a specific sexual health component, we're learning, or kids are learning at this age, about simply how to tell the difference between good and bad information. Grades 9 to 10, we now want them to identify credible sources of information specifically about sexuality and STIs, and assess portrayal of safer sex practices in sexually explicit media. So at the grade 4 level, we might use a lesson such as Break the Fake, Real or Fake. This is part of our series of Break the Fake lessons, which, as you can see, feature the North American house hippo, which we brought back a couple of years ago. I'm not sure if you can see, there's a house hippo looking over my shoulder. And so this is introducing kids to basic online verification skills. So we first use the House Hippo PSA to show them how easy it is in a way to make things that look real. And we introduce a set of simple steps to help them learn to verify information using fact-checking tools, finding the original source of information, verifying that source, and checking other sources. And at this age level, we're not necessarily talking specifically about sexuality. We can use examples that are appropriate to their development, like animals. And so we show a series of photos and ask kids to guess which one is real and which one is fake, with the idea of showing them, first of all, that you can't tell just by looking at it. So the picture below of the gorilla knitting seems pretty plausible. Gorillas have pretty clever hands. The one above that really looks fake is that shark with the big eye in the middle. In fact, as you probably guessed, the opposite is true. That is a real photo, the one on top. It's not actually a species of shark, but it's something that can happen to sharks while they're developing. That's actually a shark embryo, and sometimes while sharks are developing, their eyes fuse together and you get cyclops sharks. The photo below, the photo of the gorilla, is real, but the knitting needles and the scarf or whatever it's knitting were added. But the point here is to demonstrate that we can't trust our instincts, that we can't look at a photo or anything else and just know whether it's real or not. And then we then teach a variety of steps on how to verify it. So this is what's called a glass frog. This is a real thing. And this is an example of how we teach finding the source through using a reverse image search, where if we find this photo, someone shares it with us, we copy the image location, we go to a reverse image searcher like TinEye, and that'll show us that this photo actually came from National Geographic. When we get to the secondary grades, and this is for grades 7 to 10, we can use a lesson called I Heard It Round the Internet, which is very much focused on identifying the benefits of getting sexual health information online. It's instant, it's anonymous largely. It's anonymous in a way that kids care about anyway. It's easy, it has low cost, and there's lots of information. And the challenges that good information may be blocked by filters, that it's easy to find explicit content by accident, and it's hard to tell the quality of the information that we're looking at. And here again is one of the cases where we really do have to essentially accept reality, that kids are going to use the internet to find sexual health information for the reasons that are there under the benefits. And so we have to prepare them to do that, to help them find good information and to tell good information from bad. So here we have 3 basic skills that we focus on. One is making good search queries. So a lot of the question of whether you find good or bad information has to do with simply how well you use search engines like Google. And it's really important not to think that so-called digital natives know how to do these things. These are very specific skills. They don't just absorb them out of the ground. They have to be taught. Similarly, finding reliable sources. So one of the things we can do as teachers is simply to provide reliable sources. And that's one of the things we do in this lesson. We have a number of reliable sources that are listed that teachers can provide and that we include in the student materials, because when there is a reliable source, it's always easier to go straight there. You don't even have to go through Google. If you know a source is reliable and you know it's going to have the information you need, just go straight there. And finally, filtering bad results. Now, this may surprise you, but when we consider the fact that digital media are networked and the fact that digital media have unexpected audiences, what we actually find, and this is research out of Europe, but there's no reason to think it's not true. In fact, unwanted exposure to adult material is the #1 concern for young people, and not just little kids, but teens as well. They talk a lot about having to avoid and having to block and having to deal with adult material and explicit content that they don't want to see. And in that same study, they found half of boys and 2/3 of girls wish it was more difficult to access adult material online. So in fact, when we talk about adult material online, one of the key things that we can teach kids is how to avoid it so they don't see it before they're ready. Here's one of our lessons for grades 5 to 6. It's called Stay on the Path. And it focuses on a variety of search and verification skills. But one of the things that it looks at in detail is how to use kid-safe search engines so that you can get better results. And here's an example, a relatively mild example. So if I were doing research on cougars, on just plain Google, I might find these dating ads. Now, again, it's a pretty mild example. There's certainly worse examples I could come up with, but it's not what you're looking for when you're a 10-year-old doing research for a project on cougars. If you go to, for instance, Kittle, you look for Google and for cougar, and you're only going to get safe things. You'll get some irrelevant things. There's a bunch of stuff about cars for some reason, but you're not going to get anything that is inappropriate. Now, I've talked about how there's the media and the digital literacy key concepts, but we can apply them both. Again, those original media literacy key concepts still apply to digital literacy. So if we consider, for instance, that media have social and political implications and that digital media experiences are shaped by the tools we use, we might consider looking at the idea of avatars, at characters that represent us in video games and virtual worlds. And this is a lesson for grades 4 to 6 called Avatars and Body Image. Here are some examples of actual avatars that male and female avatars that your kids might encounter in games that they're playing. And in this, we actually have an interactive resource called our Avatar Creator that gets kids to consider, first of all, to consider what kinds of avatars, what the avatars that they're being offered to make, and the tools that they're able to use to make them, what they say about gender and sexuality, and how they might influence how they play the game. So if you imagine you're playing with an avatar like the one at the left or the one at the right, that sends a pretty powerful message, just like those alcohol ads we saw earlier. It shows a really powerful message about how you're expected to play. It implies the world that you're going to live in and what you're going to do there. And when you go to the second level, and I'm sorry we don't have time to actually have you play through it, when we go to the second level, you're given a lot more options. And then the discussion where you can there's a guided discussion where, again, we consider, well, how does that change things? How does it change things to be able to make a character who is much more like you, or maybe a lot more different from you, to have more options in terms of body shape, to have the male and the female characters much more similar than in the first example. And we can also consider, well, what things still aren't possible that might have been beyond the technical ability. So bringing in commercial considerations there. So for instance, even in this level, there's a limit to how thin or fat you can be. You can't be a wheelchair user and so on. Changing those lenses, changing our approach through key concepts can also help us direct our research and reassess strategies. And that's something that we've done with our own research for fairly recently. So when we look, for instance, at sexting as an example, this has traditionally been the lens through which sexting interventions have been approached. The idea that digital media are shareable and persistent, and that digital media have unexpected audiences. In other words, most lessons and resources around sexting, most public awareness campaigns around sexting have focused on trying to teach kids, primarily girls, not to share sexts because someone else might share them. They might be seen by the wrong people. Now, those are true, but there are some negative implications of those. One of the implications of those is to suggest that it is that the person who sends the sext is at fault rather than the person who shares it. And we know that it leads girls in particular to be less likely to seek help when they have a sext that's been shared without their consent because they feel blamed for it. Sometimes they wrongly think that it's illegal, which it isn't in Canada, even if you're under 18, to send a sext to a willing recipient. And they may not know that it's illegal to share a sext, even if the person is over 18 without the author's consent. So if we change our lenses, if we change to considering the impact of sharing sexts, if we could put in a gender analysis lens to consider the social and political implications, and we consider the ways that tools we use influence things like sharing, how they make sharing easy, and how they may make us fall victim to what we call empathy traps, then we can take actually a much more positive view. And this is something that's informed some research that we've done around sexting, which is available on our website, and it's influenced our resources as well. So I'm going to show you two resources that address sexting in different ways. This one is called Online Relationships, Respect and Consent, and it's for grades 9 to 12. It's really focused on the lower grades, and it's looking specifically at the idea of consent in a digital context. And this one is designed to not specifically address sexting. This is introducing kids to what consent is and how it applies in a digital context. So it's not just about sharing content. It could be about, for instance, privacy, respecting privacy. So we give a number of examples of scenarios that help kids understand, first of all, the different aspects of consent, and also present them in ways that we're pretty sure kids are not going to disagree with. So we give an example of a scenario, for instance, where someone takes a picture of someone while they're asleep, an embarrassing picture, and shares it. And that helps to illustrate the idea that consent has to be conscious, that you can't consent to having your picture taken and shared if you're asleep. We use the example of someone sharing a link that leads to an unpleasant and unexpected place to illustrate the idea that consent is informed. This, of course, is an example of a rickroll, which is one of the milder examples of a misleading link. But again, the idea here is that if you don't know where a link is going, if someone says, hey, check out this video, and you don't know what the content is, your consent is not genuine because it wasn't informed. Or we give the example of, and this is the one that comes closest to specifically talking about sexting, of a shared video, a video that was sent to someone and that person then shared it as an example to show that consent is a right that never goes away, that no matter what the initial sender does, they never give away the right to consent or refuse consent. Now, those are just 3. There's actually 8, but I don't have time to go through them all. So here's some content going to our second resource. Here's some of the content from our research that really informed our approach to sexting. What we found when we looked at who shared sex without consent, we found that believing in traditional gender stereotypes had a huge impact, that when we divided them into 3 tertiles, those in the top third were 5 times more likely to have shared a sext than the ones in the bottom third. And similarly, when we tested moral disengagement, we found almost the exact same ratio, 5 to 1, and that some ideas, like the idea that it was the original sender's fault if a sext was shared, were held by a really worryingly large number of youth, almost half of the young people. Even though the overall agreement with moral disengagement was not that high, over almost half of young people agreed with that. And so there is another resource that we've developed that is specifically about sexting. It's called There's No Excuse, where we talk about moral disengagement. Now, moral disengagement, if you're not familiar, that's a psychological term for talking about the ways that we convince ourselves that it's okay to do something that we know is wrong, or that it's okay to not do something that we know is right. In the lesson, we call that sneaky excuses. And we introduce 4 of them: denying the harm, saying it's not, not really that bad; justifying the harm, saying that, yes, it was wrong, but we did it for a good reason, so it's okay; shifting the responsibility, saying that, well, it's not really our fault. Yes, it was wrong, but it's not my fault. I was just following orders, or, it was really someone else's fault. I wouldn't have done it if such and such hadn't happened, or so on. Or blaming the victim, saying it was actually the person that I did harm to, it was their fault. And this lesson includes a series of videos that each illustrate one of these and give, first of all, they directly confront these moral disengagement attitudes. They show how silly they are, and they give the students an opportunity to identify them. So here's one of the ones that we show, and one of the things that the students do in the lesson is to identify which of those sneaky excuses is being used here.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. How about we start the day off by introducing ourselves and sharing something about your summer?
Hi. My name's Toby, and I'm sharing a naked picture my girlfriend Sarah sent me.
Toby, no, are you crazy?
Nobody cares. Everyone shares nudes.
I care. You can't do that. That was private.
So that's showing, obviously, the, it's an example of the mechanism that suggests that it's denying the harm, that nobody cares. We know from our own research that's absolutely not true, both for girls and boys. It's confronting it by saying there is no excuse, and demonstrating, really, when you say it out loud, how silly it is. So I'm going to close now just by showing you some of our resources to help you access the things that I've been telling you about. This is our website, mediasmarts.ca. So far as we know, it's the world's largest collection of media and digital literacy resources. This is the homepage where you can find all kinds of different things. This is our main teacher lesson library, where you can search by grade, by resource type, by topic, by media type. Our digital literacy resources are also organized in a curriculum framework from kindergarten to grade 12 in seven different aspects of digital literacy: finding and verifying, ethics and empathy, privacy and security, digital health, making and remixing, consumer awareness, and community engagement. Obviously, digital health is the one that's the most directly relevant, but ethics and empathy, privacy and security, finding and verifying, all of these connect to health education in general, and even sexual health education specifically, in a variety of ways. We also have curriculum charts for every province and territory, where we show where digital and media literacy are in the curriculum. We identify places where they're named explicitly, but also places where, again, because it's never not about the media, never not about the technology, where we can connect them even if they're not specifically named. So if your health curriculum says that kids should be learning about healthy relationships, even if there isn't a specific reference to media, again, we know that's where kids are learning a lot about relationships. And so you can go through these, you can find the grade level and the course that you're teaching, and it actually has links to resources on our website that address those curriculum expectations. And so you can see, because we know, again, I was a teacher for close to 10 years. I know how crowded the curriculum is. I know digital and media literacy are often, they're the first things to go when you're short on time, but these things are in the curriculum. We have a series called Media Literacy 101. These are short videos, we call them media minutes because they're about a minute long, that explain the original key concepts of media literacy. And there are mini lessons that at different grade levels to go with those. And there are also a companion series of 5 videos that explore the key concepts of digital literacy. And finally, for a deeper dive into digital literacy, we actually have an online digital literacy training program. This started life as a training program for teacher candidates that we did in person across the country. Unfortunately, the funding for that ran out, but we now offer it as a full online course. And so teacher candidates and in-service teachers can go through it on their own. And it really does cover in much more depth various aspects of how we teach digital literacy. It's got lots of links to resources, and it also has a lot of supplementary materials for dealing with things like the challenges of bringing digital technology into the classroom. So thank you so much for your attention. Looks like I just about made it on time, and I'll happily take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was an incredible presentation. I feel like I learned a lot, which is wonderful. Just a reminder to everyone that the Q&A box is on the bottom panel of your Zoom menu. In the meantime, I have a couple of questions for you. What are your thoughts on potentially using, or I don't know, I know teachers are always, we avoid using any kind of encouragement of sexual behavior. But when it comes to the pandemic and we want everyone to limit their contacts in person, how can sexting potentially be framed as a harm reduction strategy for both limiting the transmission of an infection and also, STBBIs, without outright saying, go for it, go do it.
That's a challenge, yeah. And we're always really reluctant. We're careful to sort of not to endorse sexting as an activity. But I think we have a responsibility, first of all, to make sure that young people understand that, again, that sending a sext to a willing recipient is not illegal in Canada. Even if you're under 18. Now, I do wish, this is based on a Supreme Court decision. It's not in the legislation. I wish the legislation were more clear so we could give a really, really unambiguous answer. What we can say is that no young person has ever been prosecuted for sending a sext to a willing recipient. And quite a few attorneys general across the country have said they would not prosecute. So first of all, because again, it goes back to that original key concept. We base so much of our knowledge comes from media. We get knowledge about sexting law primarily from American media. And in the US, that is an issue. It's a real barrier to sexting education there, that in many states in the US, if you are under 18, it is a crime to send a sext to a willing recipient. That's where kids get their information. It's where a lot of us get our information. I know a lot of teachers and law enforcement people believe that. So knowing that even though it may be true in the US, it's not true here. But also knowing that it is illegal to share it, and that not necessarily because that's going to make people less likely to share it, because there's good evidence to think that the penalty, the risk of a legal penalty is not a big, it's not much of a deterrent, but it's the message that it sends. And that's why we focus on the moral aspect of it rather than the legal penalty. But it's also important for young people to know that law, the intimate images law, does provide them with a tool for getting photos taken down. So it doesn't just have a criminal penalty, it also gives judge the power to take down images that were shared without the sender's consent. Again, whether or not the sender is under or over 18. Obviously, if they're under 18, there's additional charges that can be laid, and there are additional powers that police and judges have to take content down. But that I think is the closest we can do. I don't think, I think when we're talking generally about sexual health in the pandemic, we can encourage kids to think about, substitute behavior that doesn't violate, pandemic rules. I don't know if we can go further than that, but we can be aware that kids are doing that. We can prepare them to do it safely. We can give them the information that they need. And really, really, really fundamentally, we can make sure that they know that if they are a recipient of a sext, they have a responsibility. And that consent, as I said, consent is something that doesn't go away. That sending a sext does not mean that you've consented to it being seen by anyone except the person you sent it to. And of course, we also have to educate people about making sure that that the recipient is willing, because that's another issue that we know is increasingly a concern, is people sending unsolicited sexts, and that we have to make people aware that is that's not cool, and is also can also be that can be even if it's not illegal, and which in some cases it is, or even if it's not child pornography, it's harassment.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to clarify, when you talk about sending a text and it not being illegal, does that include images as well as text?
Yes, that is the legal opinion. So again, we're in kind of a gray area where a reading of the legislation suggests, just by reading the legislation, it suggests that it would fall under creating child pornography. But the Supreme Court has made a number of rulings that suggest that production of a photo or a video, so long as it is only distributed to people who are partners, who are romantic partners, does not fall under the law. So again, I wish that were less ambiguous. It's why I can never really give a short answer there. And what that also means is that there's no guarantee that someone could not be charged. Under the letter of the law, they could be charged, but we do know, again, no one has been charged. A number of attorneys general of different provinces have said that they would not charge, and such a charge almost certainly would not hold up in court. And certainly that may be a somewhat ambiguous answer, but it's much, it's much better than what most people, including most youth, believe. And it does change the calculus away from victim blaming. And that is the real concern. It's one of the reasons why, again, we moved away from focus on warning the senders, because we know there's a lot of good evidence that encourages victim blaming, which is exactly one of the mechanisms that people use to tell them it's okay to share sex without consent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a follow-up to this, and it might also have kind of an ambiguous answer as well. I'm wondering how the different ages of consent in Canada might play into texting. So if someone is 17 years old and they're sending a message to a 13-year-old, can that potentially have legal implications under those age of consent laws?
Yeah, it could. So I'm not a legal expert on child pornography or luring laws. So I don't want to represent myself as one. Obviously, we do, when we develop resources, we base them on on our knowledge of the law. I don't want to give a legal opinion, but certainly there is in the law for in some of the laws relating to relationships, not the pornography law, but the relationships laws, there are exceptions. The age of consent law, there are exceptions that have to do with the gap in age rather than simple age. So that would kind of fall under, it might fall under internet luring, it might fall under statutory rape. So that definitely does make things more complicated beyond, just the issue of two kids of essentially the same age sending messages or photos to one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky to know. All right, my next question is related to the algorithm. So in your discussion of networked media, how can we encourage young people to consistently be critical of the media they're consuming when they're faced with, an onslaught of algorithm-based either YouTube videos or TikToks or things like that, where you might start out watching a gaming video and then it turns into a video, mocking feminists, and that turns into increasingly more, alt-right kind of ideology, things like that. How can we encourage that awareness?
Well, that's one of the reasons why, traditional media literacy remains relevant, why it's still so important to talk about things like gender stereotyping and racial stereotyping and representation issues, because otherwise kids are not going to recognize when they see that kind of content that's recommended to them. We also do have to educate them about the ways in which the content that's delivered to them is selected algorithmically. And that, comes under that key concept of how our interactions are shaped by the tools we use. So we do have some resources relating to that. We're developing some new ones. We're actually in the early stages of developing a card game that teaches about algorithmic recommendation. So we're hoping to launch that next year. But one of the things that we can do once they understand that is help them understand why it is better to search for content rather than consume the content that was recommended to you. It has to do with being an active user of media, and that again it's one of the things that that is an overall media literacy habit, that you want to be an active and engaged user and consumer and not a passive one. So just like you don't want to just sit down on the couch and turn on the TV and watch whatever's on. You don't want to just go on YouTube and watch whatever plays next in the up next bar. It's much better to look for information. If you find a channel that you like, subscribe to it. If there's something that you're interested in, search for it, but make conscious choices. And what the research has shown too, when it comes to media and digital literacy and critical thinking, is that these things are domain specific. And that's why, while we do have resources that are, about broader media literacy and digital literacy issues, we also have a lot of resources that are really specific about things like sexual health information. It's why, for instance, we have a specific lesson about sexual health information, even though we have other lessons that are about sort of the same kind of skills, but in different topics, because we know from research the things don't necessarily transfer. So you may have learned how to apply critical thinking in history class, but it won't necessarily transfer to science class, or it won't necessarily transfer to sexual health education. That's one of the reasons why we have specific resources relating to online hate, which includes online misogyny, because again, we know that the kinds of critical thinking skills that you might use to recognize whether a glass frog or a cyclops shark is a real thing, you can use those same skills to recognize hate content, but there are other specific skills and habits and knowledge that you need to have. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why we work so hard to integrate media and digital literacy across the entire curriculum.
Well, you're doing a fantastic job of that. It's so thorough and so wonderful. Looks like we have a shy audience today. Did you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us before closing up?
I think, well, I just kind of said my usual closing, and that is that we do need to integrate this into every aspect of kids' education, because our lives, and even more so our kids' lives, they are more and more mediatized. We spend more and more time consuming media, and they are more and more digitized. We spend more and more time, even before the pandemic. We were spending more and more time interacting through digital media. And so this can't be just the province of language classes anymore, or even health classes. This can't just digital aspects. They can't just be in tech classes. These things have to be integrated across the curriculum. These are fundamental life skills that those of us who are older didn't grow up with, so we have to learn them. But we also can't assume that our kids are just going to pick these things up. These are things that they have to learn and that we have to teach them.